In 2010, a psychologist at the University of Kentucky ran an experiment so quiet it barely made the news. He gave one group of volunteers ordinary acetaminophen, the same compound sitting in the medicine drawer of almost every kitchen in the Western world, and a second group received a placebo. Both groups took their assigned capsule every day for 3 weeks. At the end of the study, he measured how much social pain they reported feeling. The group taking acetaminophen reported significantly less pain during experiences of social exclusion, rejection, and loss. Their brains, imaged under functional MRI, showed measurably reduced activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the exact same neural region that lights up when a peripheral nerve fires under physical injury, when someone cuts their hand, when a bone fractures, when tissue is damaged. The compound that reduces a headache was, according to the scanner, reducing grief. Not metaphorically. That is what the data recorded. The researcher was Dr. C. Nathan DeWall. The study was published in the journal Psychological Science in 2010. He would later describe it as the study he expected to fail, because the prevailing assumption, in science and in ordinary language, was that social pain was a different kind of pain, a softer pain, one that lived in the mind, not in the body. The kind of pain that does not require neurochemistry to explain, because it is presumed to be about meaning rather than mechanism, but the scanner did not agree. And DeWall was not the first to disagree. At UCLA, Dr. Naomi Eisenberger had already published findings in the journal Science in 2003 that would become foundational to what is now called social pain theory. She had placed volunteers inside an fMRI scanner and had them play a simple video game, a digital ball passing game, in which the other players, controlled by the machine, eventually stopped including them. No drama, no confrontation, just exclusion. A digital ball no longer thrown. The brain responded with activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, both structures reliably implicated in the neural processing of physical pain, the same regions, the same measurable response to a digital game. Eisenberger called the pattern she documented the pain overlap theory. The terminology is precise. The neural circuitry of social loss and the neural circuitry of physical injury do not merely resemble each other. They share structure. They share real estate in the brain. When you lose someone, when the phone goes silent and the chair stays empty, the brain processes that experience through the same hardware it uses to register that you have been cut, broken, or burned. This is not a finding that received the attention it warranted, but it is one of the most consequential pieces of data ever collected about why grief destroys you, not emotionally as an abstraction, but physically, in the body's own wiring. There is a companion guide called What Feynman Knew About Grief that examines exactly this, the mechanics of why love costs the body what it costs, why presence leaves a residue the nervous system can measure, and what that means for the months and years after loss. The link is in the pinned comment below. Stay with me though, because the part most people find hardest to believe is still ahead. What happens inside the brain when the person who has been there, physically, chemically, neurologically present, is suddenly not? And why does the body respond the way it does for weeks, not hours? The answer lives in a system that most people associate with opioid drugs rather than with love. And the connection between the two is not casual. It is structural. Your brain produces its own opioids. They are called endogenous opioids. Endorphins, enkephalins, dynorphins. And most people have heard of them in the context of exercise or stress. But the research tells a more specific story. The mu opioid receptor, the receptor that morphine and synthetic opioids bind to, the receptor at the center of addiction pharmacology, is not merely a pain modulator. It is a central mechanism of social bonding. Research published in the Journal of Neuroscience showed that the mu opioid receptor system activates in response to social connection. When two people share physical proximity, when a mother holds an infant, when a long partnership settles into the rhythm of the other person's presence, the opioid system is involved, not peripherally, centrally. The most foundational evidence for this came from Dr. Jaak Panksepp at Bowling Green State University, who spent decades studying the neurochemical architecture of social bonding in mammals. In the 1980s, Panksepp administered opioid antagonists, compounds that block mu-opioid receptors, to infant mammals, and then reunited them with their mothers. The infants continued to produce separation distress vocalizations even after reunion. Blocking the opioid receptor prevented the neural chemistry of reunion from completing. The infant was no longer separated by any external measure. But the receptor said otherwise. The implication took years to fully enter the scientific conversation. The presence of someone you love is not merely emotional companionship. It is neurochemical delivery. Their predictable presence, their voice, the particular pattern of warmth they generate. All of it maintains a chemical equilibrium in the mu-opioid system. When they are gone, that delivery stops. The receptor sits empty. And an empty mu-opioid receptor does not go quiet. It sends a distress signal. The same signal it would send under physical injury, because to the receptor, the distinction between a broken arm and a broken bond does not exist. This is why grief does not feel like sadness. People who have experienced significant loss consistently describe something different from sadness. A physical wrongness, a heaviness without location, a continuous perception that something has been removed from the body, not from the mind. That description is clinically accurate. The opioid receptor system is in withdrawal, not metaphorically, biochemically. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA argued that the brain's decision to route social pain through physical pain circuitry was the most consequential development in human neural architecture. The trade-off was exact. Every bond severed would feel like physical damage. Every loss would register with the same urgency the nervous system reserves for actual threats to the body's integrity. The cost was enormous. The benefit was that attachment, the most critical variable in human survival, would never be treated as optional. The brain classified the people you love as essential. It ran their absence through its damage reporting system. It gave social loss the same neural priority as a wound. That is not an error in the system. That is what the system was designed to do. What Feynman knew about grief connects all of these mechanisms, the receptor systems, the pain architecture, the evolutionary logic into a single framework. The link is in the pinned comment. Now return to the compound in the kitchen. Acetaminophen, sold under the name Tylenol in North America, and paracetamol across much of the rest of the world, has been in widespread clinical use since the 1950s. It is the most consumed over-the-counter analgesic on Earth, and despite that, its precise mechanism of action remains incompletely characterized. 60 years of use, and the pharmacology is still being worked out. What is established? Acetaminophen inhibits cyclooxygenase enzymes, COX1 and COX2, which are involved in the synthesis of prostaglandins. Prostaglandins sensitize peripheral pain receptors, amplifying the signal sent to the brain. But this peripheral mechanism does not fully explain acetaminophen's analgesic effect, because it crosses the blood-brain barrier and acts centrally as well. Current evidence suggests acetaminophen modulates the endocannabinoid system and acts on the periaqueductal gray, a midbrain structure central to descending pain modulation. The periaqueductal gray, when activated, sends inhibitory signals downward through the spinal cord that reduce pain transmission. Acetaminophen appears to engage this pathway. It reduces pain not only by quieting the peripheral signal, but by adjusting the brain's processing of the signal that arrives. When de Waal's participants showed reduced activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex after 3 weeks of acetaminophen, the mechanism was likely this. The brain's central pain processing system, already engaged in assessing their experience of social exclusion, was running at a lower level of sensitivity. The opioid withdrawal signal of grief was still arriving. The brain was simply less reactive to it. That distinction matters. Acetaminophen does not address the source. It adjusts the receiver. Now consider the second compound. Capsaicin is the active chemical in chili peppers. It is in every kitchen where someone cooks with spice, and its pharmacological mechanism is one of the most counterintuitive in the study of pain. Because it works not by suppressing pain, but by generating it. Capsaicin binds to TRPV1 receptors, transient receptor potential vanilloid type 1, which are ion channels on peripheral sensory neurons. These are neurons whose primary function is to detect tissue damage and extreme heat. They are the body's physical injury alert system. When capsaicin binds to them, they open, they depolarize, they fire, and they fire the same signal pattern as a burn. The brain receives this signal, identifies the pattern as tissue damage, and responds with endogenous opioid release. Not because there is a burn, because the neural signature of a burn has arrived at the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and travelled up the spinothalamic tract to the thalamus and the anterior cingulate cortex. The brain does not perform an audit of whether the damage is real. It reads the pattern. And when the pattern says damage, the chemistry says respond. Endogenous opioids. Endorphins flood the system. For a brief window, the mu-opioid receptor is not empty. With repeated capsaicin exposure, the TRPV1 receptor undergoes desensitization. Substance P, a neuropeptide that mediates pain signal transmission between peripheral neurons and the spinal cord, is progressively depleted. The nerve ends up with reduced capacity to transmit pain signals. This is the basis for capsaicin's use in clinical patches for neuropathic pain, post-herpetic neuralgia, and diabetic peripheral neuropathy. A chili pepper in the kitchen is a blunt, oral version of the same molecular event. A brief flood of endogenous opioids generated by a signal the brain cannot distinguish from genuine physical injury. The body does not ask whether the burn is real. It reads the signal. It responds. The chemistry is real, even when the damage is not. This illuminates something important about grief. The brain does not verify whether the pain, arriving through its oldest circuitry, is caused by broken tissue or by an empty chair. It reads the pattern. If the pattern matches damage, it responds as it was built to respond. We are approaching the part of this that is hardest to say simply, because the mechanism changes what grief actually is, as a category of biological experience. The companion guide, What Feynman Knew About Grief, is in the pinned comment below, only while this video is up. There is a question that everyone in grief eventually encounters. Not in words, but in the structure of the days. It is not, when does it end? Most people know better than to ask that. The real question, the one the body is asking, is this. If this is an emptied receptor system, if the chemistry of connection has stopped arriving, does the brain ever stop searching? Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona has spent 2 decades imaging the brains of bereaved individuals with functional MRI, and the finding her work keeps returning to is not the one most people expect. The brain of someone in acute grief shows hyperactivation in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, as Eisenberger's framework predicts. But it also shows reliable activation in the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is a structure in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the reward system. It is not a structure of sadness, it is a structure of anticipation, of wanting, of the neurochemical state the brain enters when it expects something to arrive. It fires before a reward, not after. It is the architecture of waiting. In the brains of grieving people, it fires as if still expecting the return of the person who is gone. This finding is mechanistically plausible, as a contributing factor rather than the sole explanation, and the research is ongoing. But it aligns with a consistent pattern in how bereaved people describe their experience. They do not primarily report feeling sad in the sense of an emotional response to a recognized fact. They report feeling wrong, unfinished, like a radio receiver still scanning for a frequency that has gone off the air. The brain has not updated its prediction. It is running the expectation that kept the opioid system calibrated, the expectation of presence, of return, of the chemical equilibrium that another person's proximity maintained. And that expectation is still active. The grief is not a memory of what was. It is the brain's active anticipation of what it has not yet accepted will not return. This is why grief is not linear. It does not move from present to past the way logic would suggest. It keeps arriving in the present tense because the system generating it operates in the present tense. It is not a record. It is a live signal. In the summer of 1945, Richard Feynman drove from Los Alamos to Albuquerque and arrived at the hospital an hour after Arlene had already died. He stood at the bedside. He did not cry. He noticed that the clock at her bedside had stopped at the moment of her death, and he spent time trying to determine whether it had actually stopped, or whether he was constructing something from nothing. This was the way his mind worked. He needed the mechanism. In the days that followed, he became physically ill. Not grief in any performative sense. Physically sick. A heaviness with no clear location. Not in his chest precisely. Not in his stomach exactly. Just everywhere. Just present, just wrong. He mentioned it in letters to his mother, almost in passing, as a biological puzzle rather than an emotional one. What he was describing, with the precision available to him in 1945, before functional MRI existed, before social pain theory had a name, before anyone had imaged the grieving brain, was the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex under sustained activation. The mu-opioid receptor system running empty, the nucleus accumbens still generating the anticipation signal for a return that would never come, a heaviness he could not locate, diffuse, without clear source, without edge. That is exactly what the data predicts. Not approximately. Exactly. Before this video ends, I want to say something directly to you. Thank you. Truly, you are the reason this channel exists. YouTube removed our ad monetization. And even after that, they continue running ads on our videos, collecting that revenue while we receive nothing. We tried to remove the ads so they would not interrupt you. The machine kept them running. So we created what Feynman knew about grief. Not as a business move, as a way to keep this information reaching more people. Without depending on a system that is actively working against us. If what you found here mattered to you, the link is in the description and pinned in the comments. That is how this channel stays alive. Just as the pain signal does not disappear simply because we name it, neither does this work. The compounds in the kitchen do not resolve what they reveal. They move a fraction of the chemistry. They nudge a receptor. They produce a brief shift in the signal's perception. They are not answers. They are demonstrations. They demonstrate that the brain assigned grief to its oldest, most non-negotiable architecture. Not to the prefrontal cortex, where narrative is constructed and loss can eventually be reasoned about. To the anterior cingulate. To the insula. To the mu-opioid receptor system. To the structures that run before thought. The brain did this because it classified the people you loved as essential. Not important. Not significant. Essential. The same category as tissue integrity, as warmth, as oxygen. And the signal it sends when something in that category disappears is the same signal regardless of whether the cause is a fracture or a funeral. That is not a design flaw. That is the design. The weight in your chest is not exaggerated. The physical sensation of absence, the one that does not respond to reasoning, that arrives uninvited in the middle of ordinary afternoons, that sits in the body, like something that needs to be removed rather than processed. That sensation is running on the brain's most accurate hardware, the hardware that was never meant to be subtle about things that matter. The pain is proportional to what was there. It measures the same thing it always measured. The brain did not make a mistake. It assessed correctly. It is still assessing correctly. It classified that person as essential, and when something essential is gone, it sends the only signal it has for that category. Not a metaphor for grief, not a symbol of loss, the signal itself. Unambiguous, precise. That is not proof that something is wrong with you. That is proof of what was there.